Hi, my name is Bailey. I am the work and wages researcher here at Policy Matters Ohio. And me and my colleague Aditi will be talking about taxes today. Aditi, please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Aditi Srivastava. I am the tax policy researcher for Policy Matters Ohio, and it is such a pleasure to have you guys all join us today. And yeah, as Bailey said, we're talking about foregone revenue in Ohio schools, and then we can kind of move to the next slide. So, Policy Matters Ohio is a nonprofit policy research institute that creates a more vibrant, equitable, sustainable, and inclusive Ohio through research, strategic communications, coalition building, and policy advocacy. And you can keep up with our work through engaging with our website. One thing I really recommend is signing up for Saturday Stats, where you can see what we've been up to through the week. And yeah, and please also just, if there's anything that comes up through this presentation or otherwise, please reach out. We love hearing from you. So, school funding in the state budget. Next slide, please. So, before we kind of get into all the nitty-gritty, I think it's just worth understanding a kind of average breakdown of sources of funding for Ohio schools. And so, this is like a large breakdown, but depending on your school district, this is going to look a little bit different in terms of how things are allocated or whatnot. But sources for school funding in Ohio comes from federal grants, state GRF, and property taxes. And as you can see, property taxes accounts for almost kind of half of like school funding in the state of Ohio. And we'll get into this later, but the state GRF or kind of support from the state used to be quite a bit higher, and that's been diminishing, in part leading to the additional weight that property tax has played in terms of school funding. Next source. And then this is sources of funding from the state budget. So this is when looking at kind of the GRF portion. This just breaks this down a little bit further. And so the GRF is kind of comprised of four main things: other state receipts, sales and use tax, personal income tax, and federal grants. And so personal income tax is kind of what you all pay during tax season. Sales and use obviously is what we pay, when we buy something where that tax applies. Federal grants, from the federal government, and that kind of can fluctuate a little bit year to year and also is looking a little bit different at the moment with some changes that are coming down from the federal government. And then other state receipts, by the way, is just fines and fees and kind of like license registration, those sorts of things. So that's just what we refer to in part when we say other state receipts. But this is a look at kind of what the GRF composes of. Next slide, please. So we have a view of how funding for schools is currently laid out. And I think it's worth starting with how it should be before we get into maybe the state of things, just so we don't lose track of where we want to be. So we're going to start with the Fair School Funding Plan. Next slide, please. And so this is just a brief timeline of school funding in the state of Ohio. In 1990 through 1998, you had residual budgeting, school funding based on budgetary priorities rather than the cost of education. There was heavy reliance on property taxes at that time. And there was a question of, are schools being funded equitably, which led to kind of the first DeRolf decision in 1997, in which the Ohio Supreme Court declared that the Ohio school funding system was unconstitutional. And since then, there's been kind of different attempts to figure out what fair funding means, and that kind of is what the rest of the timeline shows. In 1999 through 2001, you had the successful school model used in kind of 18 metrics to identify districts successfully educating students, then use the average cost in those districts to set the state's base cost. And then in 2002, you had, DeRolf 2 found that changes did not meet the constitutional mandates, and it was looking to set out what was needed to be constitutional. And there was attempts to kind of reconcile, and the mediation failed. So then you had DeRolf 4, which vacated DeRolf 3, reaffirmed 1 and 2, funding system still unconstitutional, with no legal recourse besides a new lawsuit. Then 2002 to 2019, post DeRolf 5 different funding plans all failed to address constitutionally. So then what we really want to focus on is what happened in July of 2021, the passage of the Fair School Funding Act. plan. Enacted after 24 years of effort from parents, teachers, and advocates, it was a bipartisan, cost-based funding approach, and it looked at the actual cost of educating a pupil. And so this was enacted in 2021, and it was supposed to be fully enacted by financial year 2027, but we're not on track for that. So, as you know, that's coming up very soon. I believe that starts like July 1st of this year. And so we're not on track to meet the full kind of means of the Fair School Funding Act. And in June 2025, the Ohio legislature and governor failed to complete the Fair School Funding Plan phase-in, instead underfunding schools in Ohio by 2.75 billion. So that's just a very brief timeline of school funding in Ohio. Next slide, please. So to talk a little bit more about the Fair School Funding Plan, it was passed in 2017. Democratic Rep. John Patterson and Republican House Speaker Bob Cupp assembled a team to create the plan, and it was also called the Cupp-Patterson formula. Uh, it was a funding formula calculation based on the actual cost of educating a student in Ohio, and it was base cost plus categorical add-on aid. And the state calculated school districts' capacity to raise funds and then contributes the remainder. It was based on property values and resident incomes, and the Fair School Funding Plan was a bipartisan plan. If you have questions, by the way, on this section, my colleague Madeline Matei McQueen, who's not here today, can also kind of lend some insight. So if there's anything I'm not able to answer, please reach out and I'll make sure to get that back to you. Next slide, please. So the Fair School Funding Plan, again, was supposed to be phased in over several budget cycles. The Ohio legislator and governor voted not to complete the phase-in when they passed the 2026-27 budget on June 30th, 2025, and instead updating the cost inputs, the legislators calculated school need based on 2022 prices. The legislator added two funding bonuses that primarily benefited wealthy districts, performance supplement and enrollment supplement. And so as a result, there was a 2.7 billion plus funding shortfall for financial year 2026 and 2027 compared to what the Fair School Funding Plan would have delivered. And it's worth mentioning that there's a couple of districts that got a little bit more than what they would have under the Fair School Funding Plan, but it's not guaranteed that they would get kind of that continued level of support and funding. And again, a vast majority of districts saw a shortfall. Next slide. And so this is kind of an overall look at what the Fair School Funding Plan would have provided versus what Ohio's budget provided to schools. As you can see, there's just quite a significant shortfall between the two. Next slide, please. And so if you're curious about how your district was impacted and what that shortfall looks like, I encourage you to visit the school funding dashboard. If you scan the QR code, it takes you right there. It's a little bit tricky to navigate through the website at the moment, but we will also be sharing the slides out at the end, I believe. And so you should be able to just kind of take that QR code and be able to find your district. Next slide, please. And so this is just an example of the dashboard, and this looks at Columbus City Schools. And it shows that what the Ohio budget provided was actually less than I believe what they had got through the previous budget cycle. And there was like a significant gap, almost a $23 million gap between what they would have got through the Fair School Funding Plan. And so Ohio's budget leaves Columbus City Schools with a $48 million funding gap over the biennium, cutting funding by 24 million compared to the 2025 funding levels. And so this is state revenue as a percentage of total revenue for public schools in Ohio. And as you can see, it's been kind of going down in the last couple of years. And one thing to just note is that in 2023, or not 2023, in 2003, Ohio ranked 35th in the nation for its share of funding for public schools. And now in 2023, it ranks 45th, meaning that Ohio has contributed a smaller share than most states do towards its public schools. Um, and Ohio's legislator keeps lowering the state share. So Ohio's legislator and governor have lowered the state share of school funding over time from a high of 47% in 1999 to 38.4% in 2025, 35% estimated for 2026, and 32.2% estimated for 2027. Ohio state share is also lower than, again, most state shares, and that's the statistics I just provided. If you want to read the full report, it's a report published by Fleeting and Browning, I believe last year. And so, looking at all of this together, we should all ask ourselves, is our current way of funding schools thorough and efficient? And the answer is no. So, why is constitutional funding a challenge in Ohio? Next slide, please. Challenge one, using public money to fund private school systems at the expense of public schools and students. Next slide. So this is Ohio's voucher funding since the expansion. As you can see, voucher funding has kind of greatly grown since it was legalized, and presently the state spends 2.4 billion on private school vouchers, or it's kind of estimated to at the moment. Next slide, please. And the places where private schools are located across Ohio or voucher schools by house district isn't super consistent across all of Ohio. So our tax money goes into this, but there's not a guarantee that all Ohioans could benefit. And it takes away money from public schools that could benefit and do benefit everyday Ohioans and their communities. And so it's also worth looking at kind of the history of vouchers and how private education, in a way, has had quite a racist history. In 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education required schools to integrate, and in the South, where folks didn't want to integrate, they engaged in massive resistance, reducing public school funding to the legal minimum, creating scholarships for white children to attend private schools or public schools in another county. In 1965, Griffin versus the State Board of Education found that vouchers could not be used to fund schools that discriminate based on race. White flight from public schools to segregation academies in Alabama had devastating effects for districts' inabilities to raise funds. As more white students left public school systems, white taxpayers became reluctant to raise property taxes to fund their public schools. And that's just to say that there's quite a history behind this, and it has been an equitable system. The way it currently functions still isn't, I think, beneficial for Ohio and most of its communities. Next slide, please. And one thing we want to touch on is where we are currently with the state. Schools across Ohio have been threatening or have had filed a lawsuit against the state, against state vouchers. And so Vouchers Hurt Ohio lawsuit alleges that using public money to fund private schools is unconstitutional. More than 300 school districts have joined, and in June 2025, Franklin County Judge Page ruled that in June that Ohio's Ed Choice program was unconstitutional. HB 671 would withhold state funding from any public school district involved in the lawsuit in the state in regards to state funding. It was introduced in February 2026 by Rep. Jamie Candelier, and attorneys have said that HB 671 is unconstitutional because the legislative branch cannot punish schools for engaging with the judicial branch. But this piece of legislation is an intimidation tactic, in essence, trying to get folks to back off with the lawsuit while it doesn't really hold a lot of water. Challenge two, Ohio's tax code is inadequate to meet the needs of Ohio residents. Unfairly, it also shifts the tax burden to more moderate earners and stifles services while cutting taxes for the wealthiest. Next slide. And so this is kind of my favorite section. This is the tax heavy section. We recently did a report called The Great Ohio Tax Shift, which looked at how tax cuts since 2005 have reduced revenue to the state. And what we found is we are losing approximately, or we would have other, if we had not kind of made those consistent tax cuts since 2005, we would be collecting approximately 17 billion more in revenue than we currently do. And the tax cuts that we've put into place haven't equally benefited groups across Ohio. The lowest 20% of earners in Ohio Those making under $26,000 have seen their taxes go up $32 since 2005, while the top 1% of earners in Ohio, those making above, I believe, $725,000, have seen their taxes decrease by $68,812. That's to say that the tax cuts that we put into place have not really benefited all Ohioans. And, you know, given that we're not ranked number one in schools or kind of industry and economy, these tax cuts arguably haven't trickled down to the rest of us. Next slide, please. So now we're kind of zooming in on property taxes because as we've cut taxes across the board, the area that's been hit the most are income taxes. We're collecting of that kind of $17 billion loss. $15.9 billion is kind of a loss to income tax that we would have collected. And that's less money into our GRF and less money that the state contributes towards schools. So as a result, we've had to rely on property taxes more. Property taxes across the state totaled 23.93 billion for tax year 2024. And 21.41 billion was charged to real property owners, while 2.52 billion was charged to public utility tangible personal property owners, which is a mouthful, so I will refer to that as the put double P tax. And you might be wondering, what is real property? Real property refers to land, building, anything kind of concrete that is affixed, meaning like your lighting things or things that are movable, like appliances, don't count, but your house, factories, farms, those types of things would be considered real property. Public utility tangible personal. I just said I'm going to say put PP. That tax refers to what public utility companies pay for the machinery and things that they use for the provision of their business. And so you don't pay the put double P tax directly, the public utility companies do, but often the cost of that tax is pushed down onto consumers. So you're still paying it in a way. Um, and so that's something that's just going to come up later, but I want to explain that a bit. Thank you. Next slide. And so now we're getting into property taxes and our community. As we said, property taxes have played a larger role in school funding. Currently, 63.5% of all property taxes collected go to school districts, with other kind of places that they go going to libraries, parks, emergency services, emergency medical services, fire departments, law enforcement, county health and human services agencies, and infrastructure. But again, a large part of property taxes collected go to the school districts. And so changes to this type of tax would largely hurt school districts. I mean, these other kind of sources as well, but given how much of school funding also comes from here, there would be a huge impact. Next slide, please. And so let's get into some of the basics in terms of how property tax works in the state of Ohio and how some of the bills that just passed in December are going to impact it. I just want to talk about House Bill 920. House Bill 920 was passed in 1976, and it limits how much revenue many voter-approved property taxes can collect. So when property values increase, tax rates are reduced or rolled back, and it keeps the total tax dollars collected about the same. In other words, higher home values don't automatically mean higher taxes for many voted-in levies. Your tax obligation is locked in at the value of your home the time a levy is passed. And just as an aside, when you pay your property taxes, you're not paying tax on the entire value of your property. You're paying it on the assessed value of your property, which is 30% of the market value or kind of assessed value. So if your property is worth $100,000 times 30%, you are paying on approximately $30,000 of that kind of property value. And property tax is expressed in mills or millage, which I don't think many folks have heard of, but it's really easy. One mill is just $1 for every $1,000 of assessed value. So if your property is worth $70,000 and it's like, yeah, if your property is worth $70,000, that's kind of $70 for every $70,000 of property value if it was like 1 mil for every 1,000. That's just to kind of explain a bit in terms of how it works. Next slide, please. And so how does HB 920 work with school funding? It prevents local taxing authorities from automatically collecting more property taxes when property values rise. And this often requires districts to ask voters for new levies more often to keep up with inflation. And so Ohio has had more tax levies on the ballot over the last couple decades than any other state. And that's in part because, as inflation goes up and obviously people in those communities are facing inflation, so do school districts. But school districts don't get that adjusted funding as they kind of face inflation and then have to go back to voters to get that kind of additional funding. And so the 20 mil floor was created as part of House Bill 920, and it prevents a school's district millage from falling below 20 mils. And previously, emergency levies and substitute levies were not factored into the 20 mil floor. This has changed because of one of the bills that passed. Um, and in tax year 2024, 477 out of 611 Ohio school districts were on the 20 mil floor. And one way you can just think about it to make it a little bit easier is you can think about House Bill 920 as kind of an oven regulator. So when markets go up rapidly, House Bill 920 is there to make sure that people's property tax bill doesn't kind of go up way too drastically. And the 20 mil floor is there to make sure that the oven doesn't cool down so much that, school districts are impacted. And that's just a really fun and easy way you can think about how House Bill 920 functions. But yeah, there's been changes made with the recent legislation. So there were four bills that were passed in December: House Bill 186, 129, 335, and 309. And I'm not going to get into all of them, but I just want to highlight some of the weirdness that came with it. So how House Bill 186 works is that it limits tax increases in school districts that are on the 20 mil floor. And it returns hundreds of millions of dollars of property taxes to owners through tax credits. And it's only granted to real property tax owners to the extent that their local school district revenue exceeds relevant inflation measures. It was estimated to cost $1.7 billion dollars. And again, this is property tax relief pulled from school coffers. This was not the state paying for property tax relief. This was harming schools in the name of property tax relief. But what makes it weird is House Bill 129 added a couple of levies to what counts to the 20 mil floors, including emergency substitute levies. So as a result, there's less school districts on the floor who would have to offer that credit, but we don't know how many less. So it's not that the full 477 school districts that were on the floor are affected by House Bill 186 because of the weird way it interacts with House Bill 129. The other thing I just want to talk about is House Bill 309 that passed, and it authorizes county budget commissioners to annually review and adjust levies to avoid unnecessary and excessive collections. I'm not sure how much your district interacts with your county budget commissioners, but from what I'm told, it's not often enough for those folks to understand what unnecessary and excessive collection means. And so it requires the county budget commissioner to automatically approve voter-approved property taxes, but only in the first year. So it allows adjustments for later years to prevent that kind of unnecessary and excessive collection. It's undemocratic. Voters go to the polls knowing what they're approving. There were hundreds of levies, or kind of, several levies that were approved in the last November ballot times. And coming this November, there is a chance that, those county commissioners could say, well, these levies aren't needed anymore, and kind of, remove them. This was a thing that happened in Parma City School Districts recently, where the county commissioner tried to axe one of the levies, and the folks of Parma City School District showed up to the point where they said, no, we're not gonna touch this levy. But it's a thing that they can do without public consent on the basis of their understanding of what is unnecessary and excessive collection. So that's just to kind of talk about some of the ways that Ohio legislators have tried to bring so-called property tax relief. But the long story short is that the ways that they've done it just harms Ohio schools. And so, they claim that the relief is in the tune of $3 billion. We don't think it's quite that much, and it harms schools. And we don't think it's actually appeased the people who are trying to quote unquote axe the tax. Next slide, please. So you may have heard of the ballot initiative to eliminate property tax in the state of Ohio. Next slide, please. And so just to talk about a little bit, this is to eliminate the real property tax. as I said, there is another tax called the Public Utility Tangible Personal Property Tax, the PUT PP, that is not going to be affected. But this group, after the passage of those bills, said, we see what you've done and we're not impressed. We're still going to move ahead to try and eliminate this tax. And it's actually today that we should be hearing how many signatures they have collected and if it's likely going to be on the November ballot. So, check the news afterwards or later today just to kind of see kind of where they're at. But it would be disastrous for the state of Ohio. It's very difficult to make up that kind of tax that would be lost. Um, and school districts would be affected, and every other group that gets property taxes would be affected. There's been things floating around that we'd have to raise the sales tax to like 20% in some places to kind of make ends meet, and there's no guarantee, again, that a levy like that would pass. And there are entire services that hinge on certain levies and bits of property tax that would disappear overnight. And one of the things I want to zoom in on, just because it's weird and I think a compelling argument for folks that are interested in this, is the impact it would have on utilities. Again, this amendment only repeals the real property tax. So the put double P tax would continue on. There are something called fixed sum levies in the state of Ohio, which means that instead of there's a certain rate and property taxes are collected with the rate to whatever amount, there's a set amount instead. And so in a certain school district, there's a set amount and that money has to be collected. So rates may change to get to that specific amount. And in the state of Ohio, fixed sum levies account for about $2.5 billion. If the real property tax is eliminated, the state property taxpayers would still have to raise that $2.5 billion. And the only player left in the arena, if real property tax is eliminated, would be the put double P tax. So that taxpayer base would be responsible for the entirety of that $2.5 billion. The put double P tax currently collects about $2.5 billion, so they'd have to double their collection, which means that it is conceivable that in some parts of Ohio, people's bills for their utilities would more than double. Because again, that put double P tax is passed on to you. So the elimination of the real property tax may see huge utility tax bills for certain people in Ohio, depending on if there's a fixed sum levy in their area. So this is a really weird niche thing that I don't think is covered enough with the possibility of elimination, but we just wanted to highlight it for you if you're talking to folks about what elimination would mean, not just for the school district, but generally for life and people in Ohio. Next slide, please. And so I talked about how it's difficult to make up that revenue should we eliminate that tax. And this is just showing you kind of where Ohio's taxes are raised from. And as you can see, the real property tax, that's $21.4 billion, outpaces kind of most of the other taxes or all of the other taxes raised in the state of Ohio. Property tax as well, just as an aside, goes entirely back into the communities that they're collected from. And so kind of the elimination of it would mean that a lot of local governments would be on the hook for making up that money, meaning kind of local income tax passes or kind of increasing local income taxes and local sales tax. This is really weird also to think about for people who are in townships. If you are a school district in a township, it gets a little weird because obviously the school district has to figure out how to raise that money, but townships can't levy local income or local sales tax. So they are kind of out of options in terms of funding for the most part if the real property tax was eliminated. And again, if other sources were pulled in to make up that property tax, that would also likely impact school funding because those other sources, like the income tax and sales tax, go into the GRF already and go towards school funding. And so this would really destabilize funding for a ton of different sectors all across the state of Ohio. Next slide, please. And so it's not all doom and despair. I want to introduce some solutions that we can kind of put forward. And I'm really excited to have folks kind of comfortable sharing them out as well, should you want to, advocate for them within your community, because I think they're reachable. Next slide, please. The first one is probably the most straightforward, that we should fund schools fairly. I say it's straightforward, it might not be. But essentially, we need to implement the fair school funding plan. Our next budget cycle process will kick off probably in March of next year because we have a governor's race this year, and Bailey can kind of hop in. She's a bit more knowledgeable than me on this, but the budget timeline has shifted because there's a governor's election. And so instead of kind of kicking off when it usually does in January, it'll be a little bit later in March to account for a new governor coming in. I believe it still kind of has to go through the stages and be signed by June 1st. Um, but the main thing is it's not that far away. So we need to start thinking about how to rally around it and actually push for schools to be funded fairly. Um, and so that's just around the corner. That's one of the ways to do it through the next budget. Next slide, please. And then two is to implement a circuit breaker. This is a really interesting policy that we're going to just take a second on. So, how a circuit breaker works is if your property tax bill exceeds a certain percentage of your income, this policy kicks in and issues you a credit when you're kind of filing that tax. Um, and so it refunds you kind of part of what you've paid if, again, your property tax bill exceeds a percentage of your income. And you can set that percentage. It could be 3%, it could be 5%, etc. And this credit is issued by the state and paid through by the GRF. So it's not being pulled from school coffers the way that current property tax relief works in. You can limit who qualifies by income or kind of the value of their property. So you can make sure it's kind of going towards folks who need it. But again, if like your property tax bill is exceeding like 3% of your income, this would kick in. And so money kind of paid above that 3% level would be refunded back to you. And this is something we could account for again when we're doing our state budget. 29 other states already have this, both red and blue. So this is not like a dream, like this is not a policy that would be new or kind of out there. It's already a thing in so many states. And there's two bills at the moment that are currently in the State House that seek to introduce a circuit breaker, Senate Bill 22 and House Bill 365. They were introduced, I think, like quite a while ago and haven't been pushed forward a ton. But again, there is still time for these bills to move forward. And I think whenever folks say, you know, we can't do property tax and other property tax relief in any other ways other than harming schools or through eliminating the property tax, always bring up the circuit breaker. It has worked so well in other states, and it's something that Ohio can most definitely implement. Next slide, please. And so, if you're interested, please read the Great Ohio Tax Shift by scanning the QR code there. And you can also register for our monthly revenue roundtables using the other code. Revenue Roundtable is a space where we cover different tax topics every month. We've done 4 this year so far on property taxes, the Great Ohio Tax Shift, tax expenditures, or you know, tax breaks, as it's kind of more commonly known as, and provider taxes. And we do them all throughout the year. We always love feedback for new topics. So if there's a tax topic that's been itching your mind and you want to learn more, send it to me because I would love to research it for you and really get that together. We have an upcoming one on fair share taxes as well, which is how can we reshape our tax policy to be more equitable and ask more of those who have more. And so I'd love to see you there. And I really hope that you stay engaged with our work and reach out to me as you have any questions. I think we're now coming to the halfway point, so I'm going to hand it over to Bailey.
That was my enthusiastic face as I get to talk about the truth about no tax on overtime. Spoiler, it's not that great. And there we go. All right, so you will still pay for the no tax on overtime. You will still pay 100% of Social Security, Medicare, state, and local taxes on your overtime pay. And that no tax on overtime is for the overtime premium pay. So when we talk about time and a half, it's the and a half portion. So if you make $20 an hour plus time and a half, which would put you at $30 an hour for overtime, you can only deduct the additional $10 an hour. And a lot of working people don't qualify at all, unfortunately. Independent contractors, gig workers, railroad and airline employees, and staff that work extra long days but may fall short of a 40-hour work week, which I'll explain a little more on a later slide. Unfortunately, those individuals don't qualify. Plus, this is one small tax break that for less than 10% of workers, and it expires in just 3 years, unlike the large tax cuts given to the wealthiest Americans and corporations, which are in fact permanent. Again, those that qualify are just those who have a W-2 to deduct a portion of their overtime. Again, it's that and a half portion. And those with an annual income of over $300,000 will receive less than the full benefit of the deduction as it phases out before reaching the income cap of $550,000 or 275 if you're filing as single. So let's pretend that you're one of the 9% of workers that qualify. What can you deduct? Again, you can deduct up to $12,500, but it's that only and a half portion. So it is not even the full rate there. And then also for contractually, that was a hard word for a second there. If you are under a CBA, if you are contractually required to work overtime, it doesn't necessarily mean that you qualify. And the best example for this is our nurses. Our nurses may work 312s, and that is considered overtime in their world. And unfortunately, under the Fair Labor and Standards Act, the FLSA, since if you work 312s, you're still short of that 40 hours a week, and that means that it doesn't qualify as overtime. So they're still paying the full amount of taxes because that 312s does not count for a deduction. And now we're going to look at no tax on tips, which unfortunately is similar in the sense of that it's not as great of a benefit as some would like to make it seem. It is only it only exists, it sunsets after 4 years, and it represents less than 1% of HR1's tax cuts. It's estimated at 32 billion per year compared to the 737 billion for pass-through businesses, income deductions for business owners. So ultimately, the benefit is going to businesses and not workers. It's limited and regressive, no benefits for more than a third of tip workers, and it's ineffective, it's poorly targeted, and it's not the relief for lower wage workers that we would like to see. Looking at the actual charts of this, as you can see, we only got that 32 billion versus that 737 billion for pass-through business income deductions. This is where, the real money is being saved, and we will provide an example of that with this slide. So we ran this through a couple different scenarios. You have Gary, who is a part-time barista, but unfortunately, the income that he is receiving meets the standard deductions. So honestly, doesn't receive any benefits despite 12% of his total income being taxes because the amount of money that he made was so little that he didn't qualify to pay for those federal taxes to begin with. When you look at Carol over here, who is a hotel housekeeper, mother of two, head of household, worked 40 hours at a hotel, made a crisp $29,820, and 6% of their income was, which ended up equating to $1,789 in tips. They see some benefit. Like there is some actual benefit to the no tax on tips, but and it ultimately determines, or excuse me, it ultimately is based off of what percentage of your income is going to be that taxable, or excuse me, that tipped wage. So we have Fiona over here where there is significantly more tax of tipped income, and they see that $1,472 benefit, but it's really this pass-through 45-year-old consultant LLC owner with their pass-through income deduction, making it a $13,000 benefit for them. Ultimately, this is still something that is beneficial for businesses and not beneficial for the lowest income workers in Ohio. Oh, and this is a fun graph. I actually didn't realize that this was in the slide deck, and I put it in the slide deck. So we're going to take some time for some questions. I know that we've seen some things pop up. questions will not be recorded, so we will stop that. But we are happy to take whatever questions you have.